Hello, everybody. I'm back again. I'm not sure about this layout. I will find out once I'm done the cast. So this is an experiment. It may actually be okay. If it looks a little funny, you can just yeah. I will change it once I find out. So for those of you who are just tuning in, I'm gonna go through the same old rigmarole. Hi, my name is Beth Wagner, and I am currently reading my dad's manuscript. He's written many of them, but this is one of them. Basically, this is a fantasy novel. It's called Guardian of the Sword. It was this edition of it was written in 1982. He originally wrote another book that I published, the blue one in the background there. Um, he had written that one in 1977, and I published that as a novel. But then I saw this one, and I kind of wanted to compare to see whether I'd want to do a special edition of this one or combine the two. And so I'm just sort of reading it to find out and to get back in the habit of doing my reading and editing. So without further ado, I'm going to be leaping into chapter 23. So if you have not listened to past broadcasts, you might want to go back and listen to those first, because frankly, now we're getting well in the depths of things. So without further ado, chapter 23. Hardinian stood by the strength of the sword, stood and was held from the dark-haired horde, stood like a rock on the raging sea, that Alsman's land might be made free. Ikar's arrows in their flight stoop like eagles from the height. Asbel's men face a western pack, stand at bay and drive them back. From The Holding of Hardinian by Fredrin Doubleaxe. Early in the morning, a pair of scouts went to check their intended path, followed a little later by the main body. There were Hygerian patrols, but they were easily avoided. At last, the warriors were nearly the same position from which they had begun the previous night's attack. Some results of the last night's work were visible. There were piles of still smoldering debris here and there, and the great ram, though not destroyed, was canted over at an angle which indicated that it would require much work to make it usable again. The Hygerian camp was busy with coming and going, though it seemed that there was an intention to launch some sort of assault. Two catapults, which remained, began to launch their missiles about noon, while men with ropes and ladders began to form into parties, and with larger forces directly behind them. After surveying the field, Rorik issued some swift orders to his commanders, then mounted. He turned to speak to his men. We are not here to fall as heroes, fighting gallantly, but uselessly among the Hygerian tents this afternoon. We wish to forestall this first assault, and to enter the city ourselves in order to help defend it. Now, let us go to give Razek's bands an afternoon to remember. Now the men who had been watching their back trail through the forest were riding in answer to the summons. "My Lord Guardian," said one of them, "there is a patrol nearly upon us." Rorik grinned. "Why then," he said, "let them be quick, else they shall miss us." He turned his horse and led them over the hill crest. All Hygerian eyes were on the assault force, even those of the sentries set to guard the perimeter of the camp. But it was broad day, and surely no enemy could creep so close to the camp unnoticed. But it was only the hooves of horses that warned them, and they were nearly ridden down, and without an opportunity to fight back. The Hygerians had assembled men to be sent to the edge of the camp in case of such an attack, but the attack was so swift that they hardly had time to move. The attacking force itself was caught from behind, and the lances of the cavalry struck in among them. Then they were turning to fight, or fleeing, or scattering, but the number of warriors was small, and the Hygerians would soon have halted them, even the few who kept their wits and tried to fight. In the same instant, however, the gate of Hardinian opened. Out came a strong force of cavalry and infantry, advancing swiftly to join up with Rorik's force to bring them safely into the city. It was all done as smoothly as a maneuver on the practice ground, and the Hygerians were too surprised to seriously attempt to take advantage of the open gate. For 3 days, while the cavalry combed the surrounding countryside, the Hygerians tried only small attacks, feeling for a weakness in the defenses. Twice, small parties of Asbalaeans went out at night to destroy equipment and cause consternation in the Hygerian camp. By the second attempt, the Hygerians were becoming much more watchful. On the fourth day, there was a sudden uproar in the Hygerian camp, and the defenders of Hardinian saw a long column of Hygerian warriors enter from the north. They showed signs of having fought a battle recently, for some of them still wore bandages. But there was rejoicing in the camp, especially after there had been time for the newcomers to pass their news on. Connell and Rorik stood together on the walls, watching. My feeling is that Fedrin has been defeated, said Connell somberly. And if that is so, we are indeed doomed. Rourke could only nod. He was considering the idea of attempting to cut their way out, to flee northward with what they could take. Suddenly, out beyond the Hygerian camp, there was a flicker of movement. A mounted man burst forth from the edge of the woods, and as he did so, a roughly made standard flew free from the staff held in his hand. The device was a double-bladed axe in red on a green field. Look! Rourke cried, pointing, and Connell turned to see. Then Rourke leaned down from the wall and called to one of the men below. Find Garth, over by the stables, and have him take out a Sally. There's a messenger from Fedrin coming in. The Hygerians had still not yet sighted the man, though by now he was crossing the line where the sentries had been posted. Suddenly he was among the tents, and though they could not yet hear the voices, they could see the alarm being raised as men turned to look and drew weapons. Rourke, cursing himself for a slow-thinking fool, shouted for archers, then ran himself to the nearest catapult, where the crew were leaning on the wall, looking out with interest at the events taking place. Prepare your machine! Quickly, we must bring this man in! Then, unable to do anything but watch, he clenched his hands on the rough stone wall, watching as the man galloped on. He rode, bent low over his mount, through a sudden hail of javelins, which left him untouched. But there were mounted Hygerians riding to stop him now, and it was clear that most of their horses were fresher. By good fortune, the man had come unscathed through the Hygerian tents and was now reaching the point where the catapult could strike at his pursuers. But even now there was a line of Hygerian horsemen galloping to cut him off, and it seemed that they would soon be able to do so. He turned to speak to the catapult crew, but even as he was doing so, he heard it thump, and looking back just in time to see the end of the missile's flight. The foremost of the Hygerians went down with his horse, and the others just behind him were just far enough back to be unable to head off the messenger. By now, the archers were lining up on their wall, bending their bows and launching arrows at a very long range, while the crew of the catapult were hastening to recock their machine. The catapult jerked again, and this time the missile went well wide. The guardian glanced over at the men and saw one of them looking at him. The man shrugged and smiled ruefully. One can't be lucky all the times, my lord. Then the gate swung open, and Garth led a troop of horsemen out at a run. The archers, now that the range was closing so fast, had prevented the Hygerians from laying a hand on the messenger. But the horse was now too weary, running on will alone, and the mass of men behind him were too many for the archers to deal with. But Garth and his men reached the messenger at the same time as the nearest pursuers did. The Hygerians had no desire to fight a battle merely to prevent a messenger from coming in. So after a few moments skirmishing, they rode away. Garth and his men, walking their horses to match the pace of the messenger's wearied mount, came back to the gate. The man had suffered only a minor shoulder wound and was brought to Connell and Rorik at once, as soon as it had been bandaged. He spoke with little ceremony, as was the custom of the men of the Seven Hills. We met them 8 miles south of Relin Crossing, my lords. An early patrol of ours met a Hygerian patrol, and we moved up in battle order, not truly knowing each other's strength. Vedran tried to break through their center with 2 squadrons of cavalry, with infantry following. He had come near enough when the rest of them come up. There were enough of them, so even after their strength in center, they had men to circle our flanks. Vedran himself took horsemen to hold the circle open long enough that our men could mostly get out, and he fought so fiercely in the rear guard that Hygerians followed not at all. We were defeated, but not destroyed. The Dark Ones left a force to watch Relin Crossing, but neither of us wanted to seek further battle immediately. Your message came the next day, but Vedran says that it is not possible for him to come now, and suggests that you return to the hills to meet him there. When the messenger had been dismissed, Rorik looked at Connell, and Connell returned the look. Well, Rorik, can we fight our way out of the city to Vedran's hold? We can, but we should probably lose 1 man and 4 of our force doing so. The more so as they know our situation and will be expecting some such attempt. And what when we arrived? The whole Hygerian force would be dogging our heels all the way, and our weakened force, added to Vedran's, would not likely be able to stand up against them. Rorik grimaced. And I would estimate that we can hold the city for 2 weeks and not much more. A week and a half beyond, using every trick we can invent, perhaps conscripting citizens. But further than that, we must have the luck of Thimel of the 3 Rings to survive. Rorik nodded. We shall need the luck of Thimel. And he died, did he not, holding fast to his position? You will support me in the decision to stand here, then? Indeed. I may be wrong, and an attack from here might well scatter them enough for us to escape. But to be driven a second time from Hardinian might lose for us some part of faith in the oh dear, some part of the faith of the army. I think that's what it is. I think it's sorry, manuscript problem. Give us a land only half free when winter puts an end to fighting, and by spring the men of Asvalon might well be less open of hand toward their enslaved brothers. I think that, like Thumel, we must hold, though this is not Dwellin lore, and though we wait only for the coming of Vedran, and not for the gathering of the elder host. May the powers who smile on Thumel smile also on us. A breathless messenger rushed in. They're coming, lords. Rorik looked at him calmly. Thank you. Make certain that the men on the walls have been warned. The prince and I shall be out presently. when we have seen to our preparations. If the situation becomes too difficult for the captains on the walls, send for us again." The man gave them a surprised look, then said, "It shall be done, my lords." He strode back out, and Connell looked a question at Rourke. Looked questioningly. Probably looked questioningly. Again, manuscript. The Guardian smiled. "You and I have. One of us or the other. You and I have, one of us or the other, fought in every skirmish since I came to you in the hills. What will the men think if we do not now think it vitally necessary to be on the walls?" Understanding dawned in Connell's eyes. "If we do not feel that the captains of the wall need our presence, then the attack cannot be so serious as it seems, can it?" "Exactly. But we must strike a balance between shunning the walls forever and being constantly out and waiting for the next attack. We must be seen enough that they know that we are also ready to fight, but we must never seem concerned about the ability of our force to hold the city." The Hygerians, in a shouting mob, rushed to the city. The archers among them launched arrows, and when the range shortened, others paused to hurl javelins. But the Icarians were using their own bows, and the men of Asbelon had large stocks of javelins to be used as well. Not all the men on the walls were not all the men on the walls were at all skilled in casting javelins, but even a beginner may have luck. As was to be expected, the main attack was directed at the breach, and though the ditch and the stakes slowed and hindered them, they were not halted. The slowing allowed them to be more harassed by missiles, and those who managed to thread the stakes in the rubble of the breach itself were met by swords within. At one or two places, Hygerians were putting ladders against the walls, and ropes with grappling hooks were being cast up. They met with little success, nor did they press the attack hard. The serious fighting was at the breach, and when they were driven back there, the others began to fall back also. The next attack was not until midday of the next morning. Mid-morning of the next day. Those in the lead brought up the bundles of brush which they cast into the ditch, which allowed them to cross it a little easier. But the archers were still waiting, and 100 men crouched inside in the shelter of the remnants of the wall. As the Hygerians came up over the precarious footing of the scattered stones, the men inside met them in 3 ranks. Rourke stood back from the battle watching. At last the Hygerians had had enough of the futile fight. For all the time they tried to force their way through the lines of the men inside the wall, the archers and the javelin men were continuing to harass their flanks. When they had at last withdrawn, Rourke walked over to the captain who headed the small force within the walls. "Well done. You know how it is to be done. If you have any questions, or if you have any suggestions how to do it better, see me later in my quarters." "Thank you, my lord." The young man's eyes shone with pride. But when Connell and Rourke were together, alone, they were much more concerned. "We have lost too many. At this rate, we cannot possibly last until Fedrin comes." Connell was frowning, drumming his fingers on the paper on the table before him as he spoke. "Two things. Many of those lost were men without armor, who were throwing javelins while Hygerians were throwing their own. And their main attempt to scale the wall was at the point where the citizen volunteers were stationed. Not that the citizen volunteers were all inexperienced, but none of them had seen battle for some time." Connell looked at Rourke. "It still worries me. But many of our citizen volunteers have fought off an attack by themselves, which has given them confidence. They are being drilled daily, and all our men are practicing throwing javelins. In a week's time, our casualty rates will begin to fall. Take heart, Connell. Connell smiled. Yes, perhaps I worry too much. Dun dun dun. So that is this one. It was a little bit longer than they've been recently. Yeah. For those of you who haven't read the other novel, the other novel I think had a little bit more magic in it, and I will I will say one. No, I'm not going to. Anyway, I'll leave that for now. Um, it's Monday, and I just got a booster shot, so yay. Um, but that's all I have for tonight. I will talk to you all again very, very soon. Um, thank you so much for tuning in. I will, and I will read you another chapter tomorrow. So have a good night.